Okay, and welcome to the next video in the paper 3 series, and this one is aggregate supply and equilibrium. Okay, so what we're going to do is just, forgive me while I move the camera, and that will happen a lot. What we're going to do is come on to the very first question, and it says, in the country of beta, investment by firms increases in the first quarter of 2019. The following diagram illustrates the long-run aggregate supply curve, LRAS, short-run aggregate supply curve, SRAS, and the aggregate demand curve, AD, for country beta before the increase in investment. The increase in investment results in both short-run and long-run effects on the economy. On the diagram above, draw and label two curves that illustrate the effects. Well, the very first thing is we know that investment is part of aggregate demand, okay, because it's C plus I plus G plus X minus M. So if there is an increase in investment, that is going to shift the aggregate demand curve outwards, all right? So we're going to get an outward shift in aggregate demand. Now, there wouldn't be any reason for a change in its slope, but still, even if it's not perfectly parallel, it's absolutely fine in terms of getting full marks. Now, the next thing that increases here is this kind of concept. Well, if productive capacity has increased, and actually I might as well, while I'm here, just draw two arrows to show that it's an outward shift. If productive capacity has increased, because what is investment? It's production or purchase of capital goods. If there is now more capital in the economy, well then what this can mean is that in the long run, we are capable of producing more sustainably. So the next thing that will happen is there's an outward shift in the long run aggregate supply curve. There's greater quantity and quality of the factors of production, okay? So now we've got L or a S1. Now, to be honest with you, it only asks for two curves here that cross, right? And we've drawn that, okay? We've drawn the two curves here from L or AS and AD shifts outwards. Now, but to be honest with you, what you can actually do is also draw the S or AS curve shifting outwards. I'm not going to do that now because it's not necessary, but think about it, that if there's more capital, more factors of production in the economy, the S or AS curve will also shift outwards. But just for this question, all you're required to do was draw the two graphs. Now, this section here at the top is left intentionally blank. And now we're coming on to this one. So it says, the following diagram illustrates the aggregate demand and short-run aggregate supply curves for country A according to the monetarist or the new classical view. Now, the full employment level of output for country A is identified at 18 billion per year. That's important for a later question. A decrease of consumer expenditure has led to a decrease in aggregate demand of 9 billion. Now, this question's a little bit tricky. Forgive me, you couldn't see the top of the question there, so I do apologize, and now you can. So this question is a little bit tricky in terms of just accurately drawing the diagram, I suppose. Nothing overly difficult about it, right? So it says, on the diagram above, this one here, draw and label the new aggregate demand curve following the decrease in consumer expenditure. Well, you see, the problem is this is going to take a while, because what we need to do is we need to shift this inwards. And how much do we need to shift it inwards? We need to shift this inwards 9 billion at every price. So what we should see is the aggregate demand curve shifts inwards and is parallel to the old one. But as my eyes are bad and this is tricky, so I'm just going to go to this point here and I'm going to go 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. And a nice little dot there, okay? And then I'm going to go somewhere else that I can hear. So this is, it's got two grid lines on it. So I can go 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. And put another little dot there. And I'm just going to take my time in terms of lining up the two dots. And I'm using pencil for this one because I don't really trust myself. And you should always use pencil. I know I used pen in the last one, but you should always use pencil. AD2. Okay, so what we've done there is just drawn the new aggregate demand curve. I think it looks okay, but in the IB proper exam, this would be much bigger. Okay, so we've done that. So that's great. Okay, so that's that done for the moment now. And I'm going to move on to the next one. Okay, so state the amount in billions by which the full employment level of output exceeds the short-run equilibrium. Right, well, what we've got here is, and I haven't drawn this in, so I'm going to say, right, well, what's the short-run equilibrium now? Well, the short-run equilibrium now is 1, 2, well, it's not actually any of them. It's 14. I was just counting the dots that I was doing there. And what's the long run equilibrium? Well, it says the full employment level of output for country A is identified as 18 billion. And here, as you can see, we're at 14 billion. So what I'm going to do now is move this page over. Make sure you can see that, and you can. So as I said, the full employment level of output is 18 billion. The current level of output is 14 billion. So all it is simply 18 minus 14, which equals $4 billion of a gap. Okay, that's all it is. Okay, so I hope, that makes sense there, and I hope there's nothing crazy or weird or wonderful about that, okay? Now, going back to part 2C, on the diagram, draw and label the long-run aggregate supply curve. Well, we should know, and I really would hope that you do, that the long-run aggregate supply curve, and again, I am just using pen here to kind of illustrate stuff, to make stuff easier for you. The long-run aggregate supply curve is absolutely and perfectly vertical. And the reason that it's vertical is because any changes in price, it's in the long run, so they won't have any material effect on the factors of production. Other prices will adjust to bring the economy back into full equilibrium. So if I go down here and I go 1, 2, which I believe this is, and this is 18 here. What I'm just going to do now is put, and again, you guys always draw this in pencil. Okay, I'm just doing this so you can see it better. L or A S. Okay, and that's at 18 billion. Okay, perfect. So we're labeling everything, all that kind of stuff. Make sure. Now, we obviously don't need to label these because all of this is labeled for us, but still, we're making a great effort to try and label everything. Okay, now it says identify the average price level and average real output when country A has returned to long-run equilibrium as a result of the interaction of market forces. Well, you see, this is what we're talking about, right? So if we're at a case here where we've got a recessionary gap from 14 to 18, that was the $4 billion gap, all right? That's the recessionary gap there. Well, what's going to happen? Well, there's going to be high unemployment. And if there's high unemployment, there's going to be lots of people looking for jobs and few jobs available. There's going to be a high supply of labour and a low demand for labour relative to each other, of course. So what does that mean? Well, what that means is that wages will fall. And if wages will fall, that's an outward shift or a downward shift of the short-run aggregate supply. Now, again, we don't, for this one here, and obviously we try to be as accurate as possible. There's no reason for the elasticity of, which actually isn't even on the IB course, but the elasticity of the short-run aggregate supply curve to change. But we know that the short-run aggregate supply curve, so AS2, forgive me guys, the camera's slightly behind, and the short-run aggregate supply curve will shift outwards, and it should be at the same slope as I said, and outwards or downwards it shifts. So what we're saying here is, and if I have drawn this correctly, and I hope I have, and as I said, my eyesight is bad, so you have to make some concessions for me. But if we look at this here, okay, I actually get 75. And luckily enough for me, that's correct. So don't forget what happens. You have to understand the theory behind these paper 3 questions. So basically, as we said, that's the price level. That's the average price level now of all goods and services. The average price level has fallen. The average amount of money that you have to give up or give over to the shops when you buy your normal basket of goods has decreased. Okay, so that's what we're saying there. Now, so therefore, I'm just going to write down here the PL or price level equals 75, and what's that measured by? MESURED, measured, I can't talk and write at the same time, by the CPI, the Consumer Price Index. And how do I know that? And like most things in the exam, if you are calm, if you are just chilled out, relaxed, good breakfast, good night's sleep, you can just read it. You know, these are the obvious things, guys. And these, it's not that they're obvious, oh, and if you don't get it, oh, aren't you silly or whatever. It's not that at all. All I'm saying is that this is obvious because you guys know how to read. So it's just reading off a graph, okay? Now, on to the next one here. This is something that you would have seen in other videos, and I'm happy to cover it again. Economists have suggested that it is important to calculate green GDP, green gross domestic product. Outline the meaning of the term green GDP. Well, gross domestic product on its own, without out the green, is the total value of all goods and services produced in an economy. And the more that is produced, the more that we can consume, and therefore the richer that we are, particularly in the long run. In the short run, you can have budget deficits and so on and so forth. And trade deficits as well in the balance of payments. But right now what we're saying is if we have a long run view, basically what we produce we can consume. Okay, I know we can trade with other countries, but still we can't run a budget deficit or a current account deficit forever. Okay, so green GDP focuses on the environmental cost of production. So the more that is produced, the richer that we are. But that's assuming there's no externalities. And there are a lot of externalities to production, particularly pollution. So green GDP focuses on the environmental cost of production by subtracting the cost of environmental degradation from the environment. Okay, so how much we have destroyed the environment, right? We're going to put a dollar value on that, and then or a euro value, wherever you're from, whatever currency, we're going to put a currency value on that, and we're going to take that away. And that's true, because right now I actually live in a city that's rather polluted, and it's not a nice thing. And I personally would give extra money if I could have less pollution. I'd rather have less production and consumption and less pollution. I would happily pay that cost. Now, this is a little bit awkward because the start of the question is on, the wrong page if you got to look like that. Okay, now I won't go too much into this because I can skip all of this here, right? Because it's not pertinent to this question. It's pertinent to other questions, but we're only dealing with aggregate supply and market equilibrium. Now, just forgive me, let the camera, there we go. Okay, so on the axis below, okay, draw an appropriate aggregate demand, aggregate supply diagram and use it to explain the impact on South Korean real GDP of the change in South Korean exports from 2009 to 2010. Well, if we come back up to here, and this is the South Korean exports, right? In 2009, they sold 412 billion US dollars, and then in 2010 they sold 448 billion. And we have to, calculate all the real GDP and stuff like that. That's done in a previous question, but previous video. But all I want you to see now is that real output, real exports has increased. Just take my word for that. All right, well, like all diagrams, we need to properly label it. Now, for whatever reason, for this, we don't need to title it, but I will, okay? I'll just go ADAS diagram, okay? Never a bad thing. Always give your diagram a title. On this axis, I'm going to write price level. You can write PL. Oh, I've forgotten how to spell level, evidently. And on this axis down here, I'm just going to write or GDP. Okay, you can write real GDP, you can write real income, you can write Y, you get away with a lot in terms of the IB. Right, now, so the very first thing that I'm going to do is I'm going to draw the economy in long run equilibrium. It's actually not necessary to do this, but again, there's no harm, guys. You don't really get penalized for irrelevant information, okay, as long as it doesn't contradict anything. All right, AD1. Okay, I'm going to put the LRAS curve here. Okay. I'm going to write L or AS1. And then I'm going to put the SRAS curve. Just doesn't again, like, you can get away with a lot of stuff. SRAS. Obviously try and be as accurate as possible. Now, there has been an increase in exports. We know that exports are a part of the aggregate demand curve, and they increase aggregate demand. Okay, so if exports increase, that's going to cause a shift, an outward shift. Okay, so what that means is now we just have to draw an outward shift to the aggregate demand curve, and we get AD2. Okay, now, just for kind of practical purposes, in order never to kind of leave something out, so what I'm going to do here is I'm going to write YFE, that's a Y, you mightn't think it, right? So it's real income, full employment, national output, which is national income. I'm just going to go across here, and I'm going to say this is PL1, okay? So we're going to, with an increase in aggregate demand, we're going to expect some demand pull inflation. And then just to complete the whole thing, I'm going to say that this here is PL2, and I'm going to leave the most important thing for last, okay? This is PL2. Now, in the question, you've got to go, like I can understand when you're stressed and you may be tired, and I'm always advising to make sure you have a good night's sleep and all that kind of stuff. But it says, on the axis below, draw an appropriate ADAS diagram to explain the impact on South Korean real GDP. So it's asking as a result of the change in exports, but it's saying show what has happened to real GDP. So at the very least, you have to show an increase. Okay, so you need to show that on the diagram, and I'll just call this Y1. Okay, and what you, or no, actually Y2, that would be madness to call it Y1. And what you actually see is that when you read the examiner's report, you see that a lot of people didn't do that. Okay, now have I done all of that? Yes, I believe I have. Okay, and what you also have to do for this question is explain it as well. Okay, so as exports increase, aggregate demand increases. And we know that because aggregate demand is C plus I plus G plus X minus M, and the X stands for exports. This increase in aggregate demand leads to an increase in real GDP. And this is shown on the diagram as the economy moves from YFE to Y2. And just to kind of show it here again, we have the economy, we have the economy moving from YFE down here over to Y2, okay? Little arrow there just to show. All right, no problem there. And the final kind of part in this, and it's not like overly important or overly related to aggregate supply or anything, but just to get the point across that investment affects aggregate supply, both in the short run and the long run, okay? So outline one possible reason for the high level of investment in South Korea. Well, lower interest rates reduce the cost of borrowing for firms. That's the first thing. This induces them to borrow more money in order to purchase capital. And why? Well, the reason is now, due to lower interest rates, more investment projects are profitable. Okay, guys, I really hope that helped. Nice and short. I hope it made things clearer for you, and I hope you're more confident when answering these questions. Okay, guys, thanks very much, and I'll see you in the next video.